If you're watching from anywhere in the world, tell me what country you're in. And while you're here, remember to like the video and subscribe for more HOA drama stories. Now, let's get into it. The trouble began on a warm afternoon when the sun dipped low over the ridge and painted the fields in a soft golden color. The homeowner, who had built his life on routine and peace, sat on his porch swing with a quiet sense of ownership that only landowners understand. His property stretched far beyond the old wooden gate that had stood for generations. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't modern, but it was his, and it marked the beginning of everything he worked for. That gate became the center of a storm he never wanted. It started as nothing more than a curious knock at the end of his driveway. Unknown vehicles began slowing down near the gate, as if inspecting it. Some stayed long enough to make him uneasy. Others left so abruptly they kicked dust across the gravel. At first, he ignored it. People got lost all the time, especially with navigation apps sending visitors to the wrong streets. But then came the first letter. Folded to look official, stamped with the HOA crest, and worded in a tone that felt more like a warning than a request. It claimed the gate was non-compliant and subject to immediate review. The homeowner read it twice. His property, his gate, and his land were not part of the homeowners association. They had no authority over him. Everyone around the area knew it. The old boundaries were clear. But the HOA didn't seem to care. They kept sending more letters. Each one sounded more urgent than the last. The homeowner shrugged them off and tossed them into a box he eventually labeled nonsense. He thought it would end there. But the HOA had other intentions. Soon, their officers began appearing in small groups outside his property. They stood near the fence line, taking photos. They argued with each other while pointing toward his gate. They measured the distance from the road, scribbling notes on clipboards like they were preparing for a confrontation. The homeowner could feel the tension pushing into his peaceful life with every passing day. He didn't open his gate for them. He didn't even acknowledge them. Instead, he kept living his life the way he always had. He fed his animals, walked his land, and checked the water lines. But each time he crossed the yard, he felt the eyes of the HOA officers following him from the roadside. Their frustration grew when he refused to play along. One afternoon, he watched a fresh group of HOA officers step out of a pickup truck. These ones looked more determined. Their stance was rigid. Their expressions were sharp. One of them marched right up to the gate as if they owned it. They tapped on the metal and yelled toward the house. He stayed inside and let them wait. The officers paced around for nearly 30 minutes before giving up. By then, the boundary between a misunderstanding and a turf war had already snapped. The officers returned with more people, then with vehicles, then with papers they waved around like weapons. None of it mattered to him. If the HOA wanted to flex their power, they had to find the right target. He wasn't one. But as their visits increased, so did the homeowner's sense of caution. That gate, once just a simple barrier, now felt like the thin line between order and chaos. He noticed tire marks near the ditch, footprints near the fence, signs that someone tried to look over the panels. It all hinted at a group desperate for control. The homeowner carried his routine with a steady, patient attitude, but irritation began to settle in. He wasn't the confrontational type, yet he felt his space slowly tightening. He wasn't going to open that gate for them. He couldn't let a group with no claim to his property dictate how he lived. Then came the breaking point. One morning, a loud clatter echoed across the land. He stepped onto the porch and saw a small crowd gathered near the gate. They weren't just observing it anymore. They were testing it, shaking it, trying to lift the latch with tools they weren't authorized to use. Their frustration must have reached a level where they believed they could force compliance through pure persistence. He watched quietly. His patience had limits, and this crossed them. He picked up the old land map his family kept for years. The paper was yellowed around the edges and the ink had faded in some places, But the boundaries were still clear. His property line stood far outside the HOA community. Their authority stopped long before his land began. As he studied it, he felt the shift. A slow, steady calm took over him, the same calm that settles in the mind of someone who knows they're right and finally decides it's time to act. He didn't open the gate that morning. He didn't shout. He didn't confront the officers. Instead, he quietly planned how he would respond. The HOA had pushed hard enough. They believed they could seize control with pressure, letters, and empty authority. But they were about to learn they had walked into the wrong fight. They assumed they could force entry. They assumed they could bend him. They assumed he didn't know his rights. They were wrong. The homeowner stepped outside, placed the old land map on the table, and prepared for what came next. The officers kept rattling the gate, unaware that their behavior had just triggered a battle they couldn't win. The land was his, the gate was his, and the rules they kept waving in the air had no power here. The calm evening before had vanished. A storm was coming, and he was ready. The morning after the officers stormed off, the neighborhood sat in a strange kind of suspense. Word traveled fast in communities like this, especially when an HOA board felt embarrassed. Homeowners peeked over their fences a little more than usual, wondering what would come next. Some pretended they didn't see anything, while others watched openly, pretending they were just out watering their plants or sweeping the porch. Everyone waited for the fallout, because the HOA never let anything go quietly. Inside the house, the air felt different. Calm, but with that heaviness that creeps in right before another storm hits. The gate stood exactly where it always stood, angled against the morning light, tall and steady on its hinges. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't decorative. It was simply a gate on private land, built by someone who respected boundaries and expected the same respect in return. The HOA officers didn't understand that. To them, everything fell under their rules, including property that didn't belong to them. As the sun climbed, trucks began rolling through the neighborhood one by one. First came the landscapers hired by homeowners. Then came the contractors working on the new house down the road. And finally, the car everyone expected but hoped wouldn't arrive. The silver SUV with the HOA emblem on the back window pulled in slowly, almost like it wanted to savor the moment. The president, a woman known for treating policy papers like scripture, stepped out with a clipboard tucked under her arm. She had the determined walk of someone who didn't come to negotiate. From inside the house, her arrival wasn't a surprise. It wasn't even concerning. It was more like watching a rerun of a show where you already knew the plot would unravel. But curiosity pulled like gravity, and it wasn't long before the view from the window showed her pacing back and forth in front of the gate. She examined the posts, the hinges, the gravel path leading up to it. She even took pictures, framing them carefully as if documenting a crime scene. Her frustration built with every step. She wanted access. She wanted control. She wanted to make a point in front of anyone who might be watching from their windows. But the gate didn't move, and the property line didn't shift to suit her plans. And no matter how many times she checked her papers, the reality was still the same. The HOA had no authority over this land. They never did. But people like her didn't accept limits easily. A few minutes later, 2 more SUVs pulled up. More HOA board members stepped out, gathering in front of the gate with the same irritated energy. They formed a half circle, muttering amongst themselves while glancing at the house. It looked like they were preparing for another attempt, maybe something more formal this time. Their expressions carried a mix of determination and stubborn pride. They expected the homeowner to crack. They thought pressure would work where authority had failed. From the porch, the scene played out in real time. No words were needed, only observation. The officers didn't care that they were trespassing on the edge of private property. They only cared about winning. To them, it wasn't about rules anymore. It was about ego. A few neighbors stepped outside, pretending to get their mail or check on their cars, but their eyes drifted toward the standoff. Everyone knew the HOA planned to escalate, and no one wanted to miss what happened next. Some of the residents had grown tired of the board's behavior. Others feared them, but all of them understood that this situation was different. A gate had turned into a line in the sand. Eventually, the president raised her hand to quiet the murmurs behind her. The board members straightened, almost in formation. They weren't there to talk. They were there to deliver a warning. Without entering the property, she placed a folded notice on the gravel and stepped back, like she was setting a trap. It was the kind of gesture that said she believed the paper carried weight, even though it didn't. Not on this land. After leaving the notice, they gave the gate one last glare before returning to their vehicles. Engines revved, tires rolled. One by one, the SUVs pulled away, leaving the gravel undisturbed except for the paper resting on it. The moment they were gone, the air in the neighborhood seemed to breathe again. A couple of neighbors slipped back indoors. Others lingered longer, wondering what that notice contained. They knew the HOA president didn't do anything halfway. If she left something behind, she meant for it to send a message. When the notice was finally picked up, it wasn't surprising to see what was inside. The board claimed the gate violated community access expectations, a phrase that didn't appear anywhere in any rulebook. They called the refusal to open it an obstruction of compliance. They even included a threat to escalate to legal enforcement, though they didn't specify which laws they believed had been broken. It was a paper full of bluster, made to intimidate someone who didn't scare easily. By late afternoon, the neighborhood had settled again, but the tension still ran under the surface. The HOA had tipped their hand. They weren't finished. They were regrouping, planning something bigger, something louder, and if their last visit was any indication, they didn't intend to play fair. The sun dipped behind the trees as evening crept in. Crickets began their nightly rhythm, but the gate remained firm, untouched, the quiet symbol of a boundary that wasn't going to be crossed. That small piece of steel and wood held more weight than the HOA wanted to admit. It reminded them of something they hated to confront. They couldn't control everything, and control was the only thing that kept them feeling powerful. The neighborhood fell into darkness slowly, porch lights flickering on one by one, but behind the stillness, a storm brewed, and everyone sensed the next confrontation would be louder, bolder, and far more desperate than the last. The second day after the standoff began, the land carried a strange kind of quiet. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that warns you something is coming, the kind that settles over a property right before trouble shows up at the gate. The sun hadn't fully risen when the narrator stepped outside, coffee in hand, scanning the tree line and the gravel road that wound toward the front gate. It felt like the HOA officers had gone home to regroup, and whatever they planned next was going to be bigger than anything they had tried so far. The morning haze clung low across the pasture. Birds moved through it in slow arcs as if they sensed the tension in the air. The old wooden fence bordering the property cast long shadows across the yard, and the narrator's two dogs stayed closer than usual, alert and restless. The gate was still locked, secured with the heavy chain that had hung there for years, long before the HOA started calling themselves an enforcement authority. The narrator knew they'd be back, and they'd come with a new angle, probably with people who weren't used to hearing the word no. Before long, the rumble of engines rolled over the gravel. It started as one vehicle, but soon more followed. The narrator stayed on the porch, waiting, watching the dust clouds rise above the brush at the far end of the road. A caravan approached. HOA officers in identical polos filed out of their cars as if they were attending a field trip instead of trespassing on privately owned land. They walked with the forced confidence of people who didn't quite trust their own authority, but hoped no one would notice. They didn't step past the property line. Not yet. They paced near the gate, studying it, scribbling notes, pointing at the chain like it was some kind of criminal evidence. It was clear they wanted the narrator to approach, to initiate the confrontation, to give them something they could twist. Instead, the narrator stayed still, letting them stew, letting them guess what was happening behind the locked gate. That was often the best strategy with people who relied on intimidation. The less they understood, the more nervous they became.
Eventually, one of the officers noticed the camera mounted on the gate post. Then another noticed the older camera positioned in a tree overhead. Even from the porch, the narrator could see the shift in their stance. They straightened, they stepped back, they started whispering like people who suddenly questioned whether they were the ones being documented. The narrator had installed those cameras years ago, long before the HOA existed, long before any of this land had been considered within community jurisdiction. They had no idea how many cameras were there, or where they were aimed, or what they could see. That uncertainty alone was enough to slow them down. But uncertainty wasn't going to stop them completely. They were determined to turn this into a spectacle. Within an hour, the first outsider arrived, a self-appointed community representative, pulled up in a car that had never once been seen on the road leading to the property. She stepped out carrying a thick binder, the kind filled with printed pages of rules she barely understood. She marched straight to the gate, as if she expected the narrator to rush over and listen. The narrator didn't move. More officers showed up, then a couple of homeowners who liked inserting themselves into any situation that gave them attention. Before long, a small crowd had formed outside the gate. They spoke loudly on purpose, projecting their voices across the property line, hoping the narrator would react, hoping they could provoke a mistake. But the narrator stayed still, leaning against the porch railing, arms crossed, watching what had become a strange morning parade. The group tried to record their own videos, each one narrating a version of events meant to make them look reasonable and the narrator look defiant. They gestured at the locked gate as if the chain itself was an act of rebellion. They raised their clipboards like shields. They kept talking and repeating themselves, all while staying firmly on the wrong side of the property line, afraid to actually step onto the land they claimed they controlled. As time passed, more curious neighbors arrived. They parked along the shoulder or stood near the tree line, whispering to each other about what the HOA had gotten themselves into this time. Some of them already knew the narrator's land wasn't subject to HOA control at all, but they kept their distance, wanting to see how badly the officers would embarrass themselves without stepping into the drama directly. The narrator stayed patient. It was better to let them unravel on their own. And unravel they did. One officer insisted on climbing the fence to verify compliance, but the others pulled him down before he could get started, reminding him that trespassing on camera would undermine their entire operation. Another started examining the old survey stakes in the dirt, trying to guess where the property line began, though they were nowhere close to the correct location. Their confusion grew until frustration replaced authority. By midday, the sun beat down hard on the group huddled by the gate. The officers had run out of ideas. That was when a different vehicle arrived. A police cruiser rolled slowly down the Ramble Road. The narrator watched closely, expecting the worst, but when the officer stepped out, his posture wasn't aggressive. He walked past the HOA officers as if they weren't even there. He approached the gate, glanced at the locked chain, then turned to the group and asked them something the narrator couldn't hear from the porch. Whatever it was, it instantly changed the mood. The HOA officers stiffened. Their shoulders sank. Their confidence evaporated. The narrator could almost feel the shift in their energy. The officer at the gate pointed at the ground, then toward the road, then back toward the neighborhood. He wasn't taking their side. He wasn't endorsing their authority. He was explaining something they clearly hadn't expected to hear. One of the officers turned red with frustration. Another crossed her arms tightly, staring at her shoes. A third started flipping through his binder as if a single page inside might save their operation. The narrator finally walked forward. It wasn't a confrontation. It was simply a presence, a reminder that this was private land and the HOA had no power here, no matter how many uniforms they wore or clipboards they carried. The officer at the gate nodded politely as the narrator approached, as if to confirm that everything was fine on the property owner's side. The HOA members avoided eye contact. Their plan had fallen apart. Still, the narrator knew them well enough to understand that they weren't finished. They would retreat, regroup, and find a new tactic. They always did. This wasn't the end of the battle. This was only the end of their first attempt to break through the gate.
The next morning arrived with a kind of quiet tension that the narrator felt before he even stepped outside. It settled over the ranch like the weight of a storm that still lingered under the horizon. He had expected some sort of retaliation after refusing to open the gate to the HOA officers, but he didn't know what form it would take. The only certainty was that they wouldn't let it go. People who believed they had unchecked authority rarely accepted boundaries without a fight. When he walked the perimeter of the property, he noticed fresh tire marks near the gate, the kind that didn't match any vehicle he owned. Someone had been there the night before, long after the confrontation. It wasn't unusual for cars to pass by, but these tracks didn't continue. They stopped directly in front of the gate, then reversed back out. Whoever it was had been watching, evaluating, or taking notes. He inspected the lock and the posts, making sure the gate was exactly as he left it. It was still secure. They had not tried to cut chains or tamper with it outright, which meant they had something else in mind, something more procedural, something that required building a case. He knew how HOAs operated. First came the warnings, then the escalating letters, then the accusations of non-compliance. If they believed the land was under their authority, they would push harder until they forced a showdown. That meant he had to understand exactly what angles they were preparing to exploit. He reviewed his property documents and land boundaries again, confirming everything matched decades of records. His land was older than the HOA itself, and that alone created tension they hated. They wanted everything under their umbrella, even the parts that never belonged to them. By midday, a white envelope was taped to the outside of the gate with a strip of red adhesive. He recognized the HOA logo from a distance, and the way the paper fluttered in the breeze felt like a warning flag. He opened it carefully, reading through a 2-page notice filled with accusations about failure to comply with community standards, denial of access for inspection, and obstruction of HOA officers in the performance of their duties. It ended with a threat that felt more like a declaration of war. They claimed they would return in 72 hours for a mandatory compliance inspection. If access was not granted, they would pursue all consequences available under the bylaws. The narrator laughed quietly to himself, not because it was funny, but because of how predictable the escalation was. They believed that paperwork and intimidation would break him. They didn't understand the one thing people living under sprawling HOAs often forgot. Private land meant something. Boundaries meant something. And no committee could rewrite that, no matter how many forms they printed. He placed the letter in a folder with the others and returned to work. The ranch needed upkeep, and tending the land always centered him. By late afternoon, he had repaired a broken fence rail on the south side, cleared brush near the creek, and checked his solar lights near the barn. Each task grounded him, reminding him why he refused to bend. This land wasn't an abstract idea or a decorative backyard. It carried his family's livelihood, history, and stories. As evening settled in, he noticed movement near the entrance road. A dark SUV slowed, lingered near his driveway for almost a full minute, then drove off. 15 minutes later, a different car did the same thing. It created a pattern that was too deliberate to ignore. Someone had been documenting. Someone was collecting evidence for a case they intended to file. The narrator knew he had to prepare. He installed trail cameras facing the road, each one angled to capture plates, faces, and timestamps. He added new locks on the barns, moved important tools indoors, and stored paperwork in a fire-safe box. The HOA wasn't dangerous in the classic sense, but they were persistent, and persistent people could create chaos if left unchecked. The next day, the tension spread beyond the property line. Neighbors began calling, asking why the HOA was putting out new notices about territorial compliance and unauthorized boundary obstructions. A few had seen the officer standing at the gate the previous day and assumed he was the one in the wrong. Others were curious rather than judgmental, but a small handful expressed something close to admiration, as if they quietly wished someone had pushed back long before now. By the time evening rolled in, the narrator could feel the storm building again. He checked the gate lights and cameras once more, then walked along the ridge overlooking the beach. The ocean air carried a calm that stood in direct contrast to the tension brewing inland.
Waves didn't care about HOAs or bylaws. They moved at their own pace, across their own territory, ruled by no one. That night, he barely slept, not from fear, but from anticipation. He knew the HOA had plans for the 72-hour mark. They would come with more officers, more papers, maybe even the sheriff to try to add weight to their demands. They believed they held the authority to approach anyone, but authority only mattered when the ground beneath it was theirs. At dawn, he walked the property again. The sky was pale and quiet. Birds scattered from the treetops as he checked the cameras and reviewed the footage from the night before. There were 3 new vehicles that had parked at the gate after dark. One of them belonged to the HOA president herself. She had stood outside her car for several minutes, taking photographs and pointing toward the land beyond the gate, as if rehearsing the arguments she intended to make. When she got back in the vehicle, she drove away with a kind of deliberate confidence that told him she believed she had the winning hand. He knew then that the next 48 hours would decide how far the HOA was willing to push. They would return, they would escalate, and they would expect him to fold. But he grew up on this land. He knew every boundary marker, every legal easement, every recorded document that predated the HOA by generations. Their bylaws weren't written for him. Their rules didn't apply here, and their officers certainly didn't have the right to step onto land they had no authority over. He watched the sun break free from the ridge and realized something important. The HOA thought the upcoming confrontation would be their moment of power. They didn't know I was preparing something entirely different, something they weren't expecting, something that would flip the situation in a way none of them could argue against. The stage was set, the clock was ticking, and the narrator felt the shift inside himself. The HOA believed they were headed toward a routine inspection. They didn't know that this time he would be waiting with more than a closed gate. He would be waiting with a plan. The next morning settled over the valley with a slow warmth, the kind that usually promised a peaceful day. But the air around the ranch felt different. It carried a tension that had grown since the standoff at the gate, and every small sound seemed sharper than usual. The yard, normally quiet at sunrise, felt like a stage waiting for the next act in a drama no one asked for. The narrator moved through the morning routine with steady hands, but a tightened chest, knowing the HOA officers wouldn't let things go after being turned away in front of everyone. Word of the incident had traveled fast, as small communities often guaranteed. Neighbors who had barely spoken in years exchanged theories near their mailboxes. Some believed the HOA would retaliate with fines so large they might force a sale. Others were convinced the officers would come back with police escorts to assert authority. But there were also those who quietly celebrated what happened. They admired someone standing up to a group that had been inserting themselves into matters far outside their scope. By mid-morning, the narrator stepped out onto the porch and noticed a truck parked at the end of the gravel road. It sat still, engine off, like someone was watching from behind the tinted windshield. The HOA preferred quiet pressure when they couldn't use formal authority, and surveillance was one of their favorite tactics. The narrator didn't flinch. Instead, they walked across the yard with visible calm, feeding the animals and checking the fences, making it clear the land was still under their control. Nothing about the property depended on HOA approval. Inside the cabin, documents were laid out on the dining table in neat stacks. Old deeds, surveys, and property maps covered the wood surface, each one proving the land was outside HOA jurisdiction. These papers were more than proof. They were shields. The narrator reviewed them again, not because they doubted anything, but because preparation was the only weapon that mattered against a group that thrived on intimidation. The original deed, signed decades ago, rested near the top. It held the name of the narrator's grandfather, a reminder that this place wasn't just land. It was a legacy and no board could rewrite. Around noon, a familiar truck approached. It wasn't another officer from the previous confrontation, but a neighbor named Whitaker, someone who had lived along the ridge for years. He stepped out and looked around with casual interest,
then mentioned that the HOA had held an emergency meeting late the night before. Rumors said they planned to get the county involved, hoping to label the gate obstruction as a violation of emergency access rules. The narrator listened carefully. If the HOA succeeded in reframing the conflict, it could pressure local officials into stepping in. That wasn't a risk to take lightly. After Whitaker left, the narrator walked the property boundary again, tracing the fence line and paying close attention to the markers that defined where HOA authority ended. Every stake in the dirt and every faded plaque mattered now. If there was going to be a fight, it needed to be on solid ground. Along the northern stretch, a narrator spotted a set of fresh footprints that didn't belong to anyone from the ranch. They were smaller, lighter, leading toward a cluster of oak trees. It wasn't unusual for hikers to wander through, but the timing suggested something else. Someone had been snooping. The tracks stopped at the edge of a patch of brush. From there, it was impossible to see where they came from or where they went next. But the narrator didn't need proof to understand the message. HOA officers were checking the perimeter, looking for loopholes or violations they could use as leverage. They wanted to find something the narrator had missed. That tension pushed the narrator back toward the cabin where the gate monitoring cameras were pulled up on a small screen. Footage from earlier showed the same unfamiliar prints near the fence line, confirming suspicion. Later in the afternoon, an envelope appeared on the gate, taped to the metal bar like a warning. It had no postage, just a folded sheet inside. The letter claimed the narrator had violated community access guidelines and demanded immediate compliance. The tone was sharp and confident, as if the HOA believed they finally had the advantage. But they still missed the core truth. The land was outside their reach. Their influence stopped at the community border, and anything they taped to the gate had no weight beyond bluster. The narrator kept the letter, sliding it into a drawer alongside the growing collection of HOA attempts to reclaim authority. Every note, every message, every printed threat was a breadcrumb leading to their eventual mistake. They were becoming reckless in their frustration, trying to force what wasn't legally theirs. It was the kind of impatience that would eventually work in the narrator's favor. As evening settled and the cabin lights flickered across the property, the woods beyond the clearing hummed with insects, and the breeze carried the smell of salt from the distant water. It reminded the narrator why they fought so hard to protect their land. This place brought peace in a way nothing else could. But that peace had been chipped away day by people who didn't understand boundaries. The narrator sat on the porch, watching the last glow of sunlight slip behind the hills. The situation wasn't over. The HOA had shifted from confrontation to quiet moves, and quiet moves were more dangerous. They were planning something bigger, something they believed would finally break through the resistance they were facing. But the narrator wasn't preparing to bend. They were preparing for the next escalation. And it was coming soon. The standoff at the gate had changed everything. What started as a simple refusal had stirred up something much deeper in the community. And now the entire situation was moving with a momentum that no one seemed able to slow. The officers, humiliated from their failed attempt to force their way in, had retreated. But the fallout of that moment spread through the neighborhood like a shockwave. Word traveled fast, distorted at every turn. By the time the sun set that night, the HOA's version of the story had already painted the scene as an act of unreasonable defiance by a stubborn homeowner who didn't respect community authority. The next morning carried a tense stillness. The road leading toward the property felt quiet, as if the entire neighborhood was watching from behind their blinds. Even the birds seemed to give the area more space than usual. The gate remained closed, the land behind it calm and untouched, but the air held a charge that hinted at more trouble ahead. The first sign arrived in the form of a letter taped to the outer side of the gate. The paper had been placed with careful precision, the seal of the HOA pressed at the top in dark ink. It outlined a list of violations, most of them made up, exaggerated, or based on technicalities stretched far beyond their intended scope.
It accused the homeowner of obstructing official HOA business, threatening officers, refusing access, and disrupting community harmony. At the bottom, they demanded compliance, payment of substantial fines, and an in-person meeting with the full board. The letter was designed to intimidate. Every sentence leaned heavily on words meant to imply authority or seriousness. It was the kind of letter meant to make most residents cave immediately. But this land wasn't HOA land. The gate stood on private property, and every inch past it belonged entirely to the owner. No HOA rule, no invented citation, no intimidation tactic had any legal power there. Still, the move made it clear they weren't going to give up. They wanted control, or at least the illusion of it, and the gate represented a boundary they couldn't accept. Throughout the day, neighbors began drifting past the area in small groups. Some tried to look subtle, pretending they were out for walks, though their glances toward the gate were quick and curious. Others slowed their cars just enough to take in the scene. The story circulating online in the neighborhood group chat had grown into something theatrical, filled with claims that the homeowner had barricaded himself in and threatened anyone who approached. But behind the scenes, though, support was growing too. Several neighbors, frustrated with the HOA's overreach for years, started sending quiet messages offering help. Some mentioned their own run-ins with the officers. Others warned that the board was planning something bigger. Their concerns hinted at a deeper issue. The HOA officers weren't just enforcing rules. They were trying to test how far they could go when they wanted control over someone who refused to play by their structure. Late in the afternoon, movement returned to the street in a more aggressive form. 3 HOA vehicles rolled in together, each one carrying officers who stepped out wearing vests marked with the association's emblem. They stood in a line across the road, facing the property as if preparing for another confrontation. The officers carried clipboards, body cameras, and an unmistakable sense of determination. This time, they weren't just trying to enter, they were trying to show the entire neighborhood that they were the ones in charge. The homeowner stayed behind the gate again, not out of fear, but because the land's boundary line spoke for itself. The officers approached, stopping just inches from the gate, as if it expected it to open simply because they arrived with more force. Instead, the quiet remained. They examined the gate as though they expected to find some violation hidden in its hinges. When that offered nothing, they began recording their presence for documentation, narrating false reasons for why they were there. Then one of them stepped forward and taped a new notice to the gate. This one was thicker, printed on official-looking forms meant to mimic legal authority. The HOA had issued an ultimatum. If the gate wasn't opened within 48 hours for a compliance inspection, they would escalate the matter to what they called community enforcement measures. The wording was vague, but the intent was obvious. They were threatening to push harder, possibly with police involvement again. The officers took photos of the property from every angle they could reach, even though none of it was within their jurisdiction. They lingered long enough to make sure everyone nearby saw their presence. Then, once satisfied with the display, they left as a group, their cars drifting away like a small convoy. As the dust settled, the tension didn't. The notice on the gate seemed heavier than paper. It represented another attempt to test boundaries, not just physical ones, but legal and personal ones too. The HOA wasn't stopping until they either gained access or lost whatever battle they were convinced they were fighting. But while the officers were sure their show of force had put pressure on the homeowner, they didn't realize they were pushing him in a different direction entirely. By trying to intimidate him, they had given him exactly what he needed: written threats, recorded attempts to enter private property, and documentation that proved how far beyond their own rules they had stepped. Inside the gate, preparations quietly continued. The homeowner wasn't acting out of anger, but out of the need to secure what was his. The cameras placed around the property had captured everything, from the officers' first arrival to their exaggerated attempts to appear official. The recordings showed the deception clearly. They showed the harassment. They showed the overreach. And with every passing hour, the homeowner grew more confident that the HOA had crossed lines they couldn't easily walk back. As the sun dipped toward the tree line, the land fell into a steady calm again. The gate remained firm, the property silent except for the evening wind. But beneath that quiet was something new, a sense that the next move wasn't going to come from the HOA. For the first time since the standoff had begun, the homeowner was preparing to take action of his own. The 48-hour deadline had been set, but the HOA had no idea that the clock was counting down for them as well. The stage for the next confrontation was already forming. The uproar from the previous day lingered through the neighborhood like humidity that refused to burn off. Word about the locked gate, the stalled officers, and the escalating standoff moved from porch to porch faster than any official notice the association had ever delivered. By morning, the HOA board tried to regroup and restore some sense of control, but everything they attempted only pushed the situation toward another explosion. The board president, already rattled from how badly their earlier plan failed, called an emergency meeting at the clubhouse. They expected a small group of loyal rule followers, but the turnout looked more like a village uprising. Homeowners who had stayed quiet for months now filled every chair, and those who didn't find a seat pressed against the walls. Most looked tired. Many looked fed up. A few were clearly there just to witness whatever meltdown would happen next. The tension didn't bother the board at first. They had grown used to enforcing rules, barking orders, and speaking like their word was law. But something in the room was different this time. The homeowners weren't intimidated. They weren't deferential. They had started to see that the board wasn't unstoppable, and that shift left the board scrambling to figure out how to keep control. The meeting opened with a rushed attempt to justify the officers being sent to my gate. The board insisted it had been necessary, calling it a routine compliance check. But the crowd responded with a wave of exasperated noise, people shaking their heads and muttering as if they were listening to the most obvious lie possible. They knew what had happened wasn't routine. It was personal. It was retaliatory. And they weren't buying the polished version the board was now trying to sell. That uneasy energy spread across the neighborhood after the meeting ended. Some residents avoided each other entirely, while others formed small clusters at the ends of their driveways, quietly exchanging theories about what the board was planning next. Every conversation circled back to one truth none of them could ignore. If the board had failed to control me, they were likely preparing a much heavier response to save face. That fear made almost everyone in the neighborhood feel exposed. Back at my land, the gate stayed shut, and the cameras kept recording every angle of the road and the area near the clubhouse. Nothing about the board's behavior suggested they were ready to back off. If anything, their embarrassment from the failed show of authority pushed them toward even more desperate measures. Around midday, a patrol vehicle rolled slowly past my gate. It didn't stop. It didn't activate lights. It only crawled forward at a pace designed to announce itself without taking any official action. The officer behind the wheel didn't make eye contact with the cameras or the house. He simply continued along until the truck disappeared around the curve. The association planned something. They just didn't want to tip their hand too soon. Yet the failed intimidation attempt had cost them something they didn't know how to win back. Residents began talking openly instead of whispering. They compared experiences. They exchanged letters they had saved. They pieced together small moments that, when added up, formed a larger, uglier pattern. The board had been overreaching for years. They had bullied quiet homeowners, targeted those who didn't push back, and tightened control through fear. Now, that fear was slipping out of their hands. Later in the afternoon, the board called another meeting, this time with a handful of homeowners they believed were reliable allies. They attempted to spin the situation again, But the tone had already changed. Their supporters weren't confident anymore. They wanted answers. They wanted reassurance. They wanted proof the board had the authority they claimed. They couldn't provide it. They hadn't expected anyone to challenge them long enough to ask for it. That shift created cracks they couldn't repair. One homeowner quietly confronted them about the officer encounter. Another questioned why the board had never shown clear documentation supporting their enforcement powers. A third asked why they refused to acknowledge my property lines and the fact that my land, including the gate, sat outside their jurisdiction. The questions weren't loud, but they were sharp and direct, and each one chipped away at the illusion of control the board had relied on. By evening, the board's internal unity looked more fragile than anyone expected. Members whispered among themselves, trying to strategize before the situation fell apart completely. They needed a way to reassert authority, but every option available to them looked risky or humiliating. They couldn't call the officers again without proper cause, they couldn't force the gate open, and they couldn't escalate without proving to the whole neighborhood just how desperate they were. Across the community, residents sensed something shifting. Some kept their lights off and stayed inside, not wanting to be involved in anything that could drag them into another confrontation. Others moved more confidently, shaking off years of quiet compliance. They realized the board wasn't an immovable force. It was a group of people who simply acted like one. Once that illusion cracked, it didn't rebuild easily. The sun set slowly, stretching shadows across the road and illuminating how still everything had become. For the first time in days, no officers came by, no notices were taped to gates or mailboxes, no board member marched past pretending to be on a routine inspection. The silence felt like a warning. The board weren't done. They had simply paused long enough to regroup. Inside my home, I reviewed footage, documents, maps, and the long trail of missteps the association had made. They believed they were cornering me, but every decision they made tightened the pressure on themselves instead. Their attempt to control my gate had triggered something too big to contain. The neighborhood no longer trusted them, their supporters no longer defended them, and the officers who once casually responded to their calls now approached with caution. By the end of the night, one thing became clear. The next move wouldn't be subtle. It wouldn't be quiet. The board had reached the point where they either doubled down or collapsed entirely, and everything about their pride suggested they would choose the loudest, most dramatic option. The stage was set, the pressure was high, and the association was preparing one more attempt to reclaim their authority. The final morning in the standoff began with a strange kind of quiet, the type that settles over land after a long run of tension. The officers who once marched up to the gate with clipboards, threats, and certainty now kept their distance. The HOA board members who used to linger at the edge of the property with folded arms and smug looks now stayed in their cars with engines running, as if ready to drive off at the first sign of trouble. It felt as if everyone finally understood what the land meant and why the gate mattered so much. The sun had barely risen when the first ripple of change rolled through the property. A county vehicle pulled up, not the type used for enforcement or citations, but one usually reserved for land surveyors and title specialists. It stopped a few feet from the gate. The door opened, and a senior county official stepped out, dressed plainly, carrying only a folder and a measuring wheel. There was no tension in his posture, no sense of confrontation. Instead, he looked at the gate as if the weeks of chaos leading up to this moment were already a thing of the past. He called for an HOA representative and motioned them toward the property boundary. None of them moved at first. They hesitated, unsure if stepping forward might mean stepping into embarrassment. Eventually, one of them approached. Together, the two made their way along the property line, marking points, checking stakes, confirming boundaries that had been ignored in the rush to control things. The rest of the group stood by in silence, clearly realizing that this was the moment the truth would either affirm or collapse their entire case. For the first time since the conflict began,
The HOA officers didn't puff up their chests or talk loudly amongst themselves. They simply watched, waiting for the verdict they suspected they wouldn't like. As the official finished his inspection, he returned to the gate and requested that everyone step back. He didn't raise his voice or act dramatic. He simply unfolded the documents and began reading the findings he'd compiled from older land records, property maps, and updated survey models. The conclusion wasn't delivered in a loud or humiliating way. It was calm, concise, and direct. The gate was not on HOA land. The driveway was not part of any easement. The property boundaries extended exactly where the old records said they did. The HOA had no authority, none at all, over the land, the fence, or anything connected to it. The officers and board members tried to keep their reactions neutral, but their faces gave away everything. It wasn't anger this time. It was something closer to resignation, the feeling of people who've finally run out of arguments they thought they could push. The county official closed the folder and handed a certified copy of the report to both sides. The moment he walked back to his vehicle and drove off, the HOA group turned toward their cars as if the air had suddenly grown heavy. But the final unraveling wasn't over yet. One of the HOA officers received a call. The ringtone was loud enough for those nearby to hear. Her expression shifted as she listened, her posture stiffening with a level of surprise she clearly hadn't expected. When she hung up, she didn't bark orders or try to regain control. She quietly informed the rest of the group that the county's legal department had reviewed their actions over the past 2 weeks. The forced attempts to enter private property, the unauthorized demands, and the escalating pressure they'd used were now the subject of a formal investigation. The officers looked stunned. The board members stared at the ground. The confidence that once pushed them to challenge every inch of the land now dissolved into quiet retreat. One by one, their vehicles reversed away from the gate, wheels crunching against the gravel as they disappeared down the road. What remained was an unexpected calm. The noise, the threats, the constant presence of clipboards and uniforms, all of it vanished in a single morning. The land felt different without them. The air somehow lighter, the silence becoming the type that belongs to open space rather than confrontation. With the area finally clear, it was time to walk the length of the property again and let the tension drain from the soil. Every step reminded of why the gate mattered so much. It wasn't just metal and wood. It was the boundary between the land's history and someone else's attempt to rewrite it for convenience. It represented autonomy, legacy, and the right to preserve a place that existed long before any HOA officer held a badge. By afternoon, neighbors began passing by, some slowing down to take in the sight of the now quiet gate. A few offered supportive waves through their windows. Others simply nodded, acknowledging that the conflict had reached its end. Word spread quickly that the county had sided with the property owner, and the HOA would be pulling back from its more aggressive enforcement attempts. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the hills, the property returned to its natural rhythm. The breeze moved through the grass. The trees rustled the way they always had before the confrontation began. The gate stood firm, closed, not out of spite or defiance, but in respect for the land it protected. The quiet victory was more meaningful than any public confrontation could have been. It didn't need celebration or dramatic ending statements. The peace alone was enough. The message had been delivered clearly. The land had rules long before the HOA existed, and those rules were not up for negotiation. As night settled in, a final sense of closure came with it. The conflict had pushed limits, tested patience, and revealed just how far some groups would go to assert control. But it also showed the strength of someone who knew their rights, trusted the truth, and refused to let anyone override their boundaries. The gate stayed closed, the land remained untouched, and the chapter finally ended on the side it always belonged to.